Let's scoot down to 48, attributed to the sons of Korah. And again, the timing of this one is very uncertain. Some scholars suggest that this may have been a ceremonial song and kind of tradition that was shared during the Feast of Tabernacles. It could be during the time of David, or it would have been late David, or maybe Solomon, but it's probably extending a little bit after that. It actually may be drawing from traditions that were during the time of David and Solomon and being kind of repackaged for a later occasion, which could have been the time when Sennacherib's army was miraculously defeated, which we'll get into later on in history. So again, kind of the time frame we're looking at is kind of maybe from the time of David, but more likely a little bit later on. But there's kind of a lot to be said about Psalm 48. So I want to go ahead and get into it, and we'll worry about the exact timing of it later. In that maybe timing of David or divided kingdom, more likely during the divided kingdom era. So just as a quick summary, the wicked confederation of Psalm 2 are described here in Psalm 48. They're overcome with dread at the sudden appearance of God's heavenly city. The people of God rejoice as they explore the heavenly city's glorious design during the Messianic age. Now I'm going to break that down a little bit. We're going to look at some of these verses. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion, the far north, the city of the great king. Within her citadels, God has made himself known as a fortress. So again, we've got this kind of, here's the setup. Anyway, now there's a good argument that this psalm was used during the Feast of Tabernacles as a rehearsal for celebrating the beauty of restored Jerusalem during the Messianic age. So it could have been that there are parts of this psalm that were tradition during the Feast of Tabernacles, during some kind of ceremony, where they would say this, they would sing this prophetically about current Jerusalem, but also about prophetic future Messianic Jerusalem, let's say. It's remarking and celebrating the beauty that is promised when the Messiah reigns in Jerusalem. This psalm does have some complementary, maybe historical application, but it also has prophetic relevance. Though some of the exact interpretations of what that prophetic relevance is does vary. Let's talk about that for a second. Some suggest Psalm 48 refers to the restored earthly Jerusalem during the Messianic reign, which is later described in Ezekiel, let's say chapters 40 through 48. Others suggest that Psalm 48 refers to the appearance of the heavenly city of God in the sky above earthly Jerusalem when the Messiah arrives to defeat Israel's enemies. Why do we think that? Well, we'll get into that in just a moment. Given the descriptive, there's a lot of descriptive similarities that we'll look at here in a moment. Either interpretation does require some basic assumption. I don't know if we can look at this verse, this chapter by itself, and necessarily say for sure which interpretation it is. But I'm going to give you my take, and I have included some more about this in the notes. So if you want to dive into this a little bit more on your own, based on what's probably the best biblical harmony with the rest of biblical prophecy, I'm inclined to interpret Psalm 48 as the heavenly city of God. Literally, the heavenly city of God. God told Abraham in Genesis 15 that he would be a sojourner in the promised land and that he would have to wait for a future inheritance of that promised land. And Hebrews chapters 10 and 11 and 12 later clarify that Abraham set his hope on a heavenly city whose builder and maker is God as his inheritance. God's heavenly and earthly dwellings are correlated during the Messianic age of covenant fulfillment. So there's some substantiation for the idea that the heavenly and earthly thrones are adjacent during the Messianic age. Now, being more than 2,500 years removed from the writing of this psalm, it's probably impossible for us to determine precisely how the original audience would have interpreted Psalm 48, what their kind of prophetic understanding would have been. The psalm's prophetic relevance is well substantiated regardless of when and how and what was believed when it was written. but this may be one of a few examples where the original audience might not have fully understood the prophetic implications of their tradition. Or maybe we're wrong, and we are not giving enough credit to the original author and audience for their prophetic awareness. Maybe they truly did understand what was being talked about, and maybe they did have some prophetic insight into the heavenly city of God. That's not unprecedented because, again, the writer of Hebrews says even Abraham had insight into this heavenly city whose builder and maker is God. And later prophets would reinforce the interpretation, which we'll get to in some future weeks, that this heavenly city is relevant when the Messiah delivers Israel and is enthroned in earthly Jerusalem. Okay, so back to text itself, 1-3, which we just read. The people praise God for his holy and exalted city. Now, scholars admit that these descriptions of the city of our God, the holy mountain, beautiful in elevation and the joy of all the earth, these verses often pertain to restored earthly Jerusalem or God's heavenly city. Could go either way. And you find these descriptions in different parts of the Bible referring to each city. Now, typically, the surrounding verses are the best indicators of which city is the focus of that particular passage. So, thus far, from 1-3, these verses are accurate descriptions of both cities. They would be biblically consistent with both. Now, just as the earthly temple reflected many heavenly truths, restored earthly Jerusalem will intentionally reflect God's heavenly city in many specific ways. So, interpreting these descriptions as either earthly or heavenly Jerusalem can sometimes overlook the complementary nature of the cities. Sometimes the biblical interpretation is actually describing both. We don't have to choose. Is this just earthly or just heavenly? Actually can be both in some circumstances. Now, verse 3, within her citadels, God made himself known as a fortress. The city of God is given the most glorious privilege and purpose of all cities. This is the capital city of the kingdom of God, where God chooses to manifest his power and reveal himself to the nation. Okay, so let's get down to what's probably the more telling section. 4-7 are probably the best context clue of which city is being described. Scholars generally agree that the kings that are assembled in verses 4-7 are the wicked confederation of Psalm 2. There's a common correlation drawn between the kings assembled in Psalm 48 and the wicked confederation of Psalm 2. Do go together, and scholars recognize that. The wicked confederation of kings that assembles to invade Israel, they assemble to invade Israel and nullify God's covenant. But in verse 5, something causes the wicked kings to be overcome with dread. Scholars differ about maybe what specifically is revealed. Some say the dread occurs merely by the arrival of Israel's Messiah into Jerusalem, as though Jerusalem itself undergoes some kind of instantaneous transfiguration. And the suggestion of this instantaneous transfiguration, it conflicts with the broader biblical descriptions of the future restoration of earthly Jerusalem. While miraculous signs and wonders will occur, those miracles don't amount to the instantaneous restoration of the entire city as described in Psalm 48. The restoration of earthly Jerusalem has a far more gradual and practical process. So if it's improbable that the dread is being caused by the appearance of the earthly city, then the more probable and more probably biblically harmonious possibility is that we're actually talking about the heavenly city. This is the first time that I know of where the heavenly city's appearance accompanies the arrival of Israel's messianic king in biblical prophecy. I don't know if I've seen them together in the same verse, like in the same chapter, that they're being described as being simultaneous. That we have this arrival of the city with the arrival of the Messiah. Now, later biblical prophets complement this interpretation a lot. This is a lot easier to reinforce later, but this is kind of the first time chronologically where we're seeing these things described together, putting Psalm 2, the arrival of the Messianic King, and Psalm 48 is the arrival of the heavenly city together. That's pretty remarkable. But it's, again, as remarkable as it is right now, historically, it's way more substantiated in later chapters that we're going to get into that come along later on in history, some later prophets, and even the New Testament, like the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, this is a lot more obvious, but just here, without having looked at Revelation, which these writers and the audience here would not have had the book of Revelation as their reference. So it's kind of remarkable that they're describing this. So here's my conclusion. I'm inclined to suggest that most likely Psalm 48 describes the heavenly city of God entering the atmosphere above Jerusalem when the Messiah arrives to defeat Israel's enemies. Psalm 2 and Psalm 48 go together. It's no wonder then that the Psalms describe the wicked confederation as overcome with overwhelming dread. So let's look at the actual verses. Okay. As soon as they saw it, what's the it? Well, the it is the city. We were talking about the city. Just look up. We're talking about great is the Lord and his city. There's like a correlation with the city is part of this. You can't separate within her citadels. You're not totally jumping out of context to say that the it is something other than the city, the appearance of the city. And so as this wicked confederation comes against Israel to invade and nullify the covenant, the Messiah is arriving to deliver. Their Messianic King arrives with great power and terror, and this city appears. As soon as they saw it, they were astounded. They were in panic. They took flight, trembling, it took hold of them. Right there, anguish as a woman in labor. Now, later prophets, later in history, are going to reference that trembling is going to overcome the wicked kings as a woman in labor. And some people will argue, well, did the prophet get it from here, or did this author get it from the prophet? No, I think more strongly, this is probably where the prophet that we'll reference later derives that phrase. But we'll get to that. Remember that. Woman in labor, we'll reference that labor when we get into Isaiah and a couple other places. So that'll be some future weeks we can look forward to, and that'll be a fun cross-reference. But I do think that the writing of this precedes that. I think. They could be really close, but I'll make sure to reference it later when we get there. By the east wind, you've shattered the ships of Tarshish. Okay, so at the time, there was a pagan worship of a god, a storm god, that was a version of Baal. And so really in verse 7, what most commentators attribute this to is that the God of Israel is being demonstrated as superior over the storm gods of the day, this Baal of the day. That God is victorious even against them and destroys Israel's adversaries who even may travel by sea from more distant lands. It's not just their land invaders, their neighbors by land, but it's the sea invaders who would try to come at them from the Mediterranean. God's going to demonstrate his authority over them and over any other gods who are attributed to have authority. Let's look at verse 8. As we have heard, so we have seen. Just acknowledge that. Just thank God for that. As we have heard, so we have seen. Let me just stop. This is the moment. I mean, this is what the author of Hebrews is talking about in Hebrews 11. Of these heroes of the faith died, having not inherited their full promise, but who will inherit them at Jesus' return. The author of Hebrews gives this beautiful message of hope because there are many who have died who were in that first part. We've heard a promise, and we've died waiting for it. But here, at the arrival of the Messiah and the descending of this heavenly city, everyone will say, as we have heard, so we have seen. God, let it be done in our day. It's that beautiful, even as we've heard the promises of the covenants, and these promises that have been our hope, they've become our present reality. How beautiful is that? As we have heard, so we have seen. Now it is accomplished. It is finished. In the city of the Lord of hosts, in the city of our God. Again, the city. It's just making me happy. Which God will establish forever. This is not a temporary interim fulfillment. And I do think that there have been some temporary interim fulfillments where we see the breaking in of God's covenant promises in interim way. But here, which God will establish forever. This is permanent. This is a lasting thing, which is one of the indicators that we're talking about the end of the age and the final deliverance of Jerusalem. Oh, it's awesome. It's awesome. I just praise God for that phrase. It gives me so much hope. It just has become a prayer of my heart. And I'll pray that for each of you that as we have heard, so we have seen. The goodness of God that we've heard about, the legends of great revivals and the inbreaking of his promises. God let us. So at this point, the promises that have long supplied God's people with hope to enter an age of tangible covenant fulfillment. No longer is God's covenant confined to stories of the past or the hope of the future, but it's God's covenant promises become the present reality during the Messianic age. That's awesome. Now, verse 9, God's steadfast love is revealed in the manifest glory of the city's intricate design. We've thought on your steadfast love, O God, in the midst of your temple. It's not just, oh, we had a nice worship service at church. This is more than that. We're actually meditating on the steadfast love of God in the design and the glory that's revealed in the city itself. It's beautiful. The city of God is more than just a place of worship. It's a place where God reveals himself, even through the design of the building, the design of the structure. It's awesome. Verse 10, oh, as your name, O God, so your praise reaches ends of the earth. And this is having global impact. What's happening is having this global renown. Now, I don't know if I can say if there's been a time in Israel's history, well, not in a permanent way, where God has glorified his holy city in a way that's had lasting global renown reaching the ends of the earth. Ends of the earth. Ends of the earth. I mean, that's amazing. Your renowned glory reaches the ends of the earth. I do think that kind of correlates a little bit with what we talked about in Psalm 67. We talked about God will bless us so that the ends of the earth will experience his saving power, that there is actually kind of an order of operations. Actually, the arrival of the Messiah, the descending of the city, the defeat of Israel's enemies is part of the process of the permanent full salvation of the ends of the earth, which is the Great Commission. It is the fulfillment of the Great Commission in the fullest sense. Now, again, we can see interim fulfillments of that. Many of them, even when they have happened, haven't had permanent impact. But this is an age, the Messianic age, is where all of this reaches completion, permanent, such a beautiful way. Okay, let's just move on. There's more I would talk about on that, but let's get down to let Mount Zion be glad, let the daughters of Judah rejoice because of your judgment. Okay, how often has your pastor instructed you to rejoice in God's judgment? Maybe that's a terminology thing, but let's get into it for a second. Now, the Bible describes God's judgment through three broad categories. I've included these in the notes. In fact, I'll leave it. You can see them in the notes. I'll try. We'll see. I know the text is small. I put it here. Verse 11 is kind of toward the top of what you can see on the stream. The Bible describes God's judgment through three broad categories. First, there's punitive judgment that's experienced by the wicked and unrepentant. That would be what we talked about just a few verses above, in that, like 4-7, the kings are gripped with terror and anguish of a woman in labor. That is punitive judgment. That's not redemptive discipline. That's wrath. That's different. That's judgment, but it's wrath. Second is redemptive discipline. There's redemptive judgment of God that is an appeal to God's people. That's experienced by the saints to correct misconduct and address threats against their heavenly calling. And redemptive discipline is not punitive. It's not just punishment, but it is a divine invitation to reconciliation and to return to covenant blessing. That is judgment, but that's redemptive discipline. Number 3 is favorable judgment. Favorable judgment is experienced by the saints as vindication and rewards. It's when their judge judges in their favor. They receive a favorable judgment. Not discipline. It's not punitive. It's just my judgment on you is favorable. Now, David would reference this favorable judgment semi-frequently. I've included a example. It's really small. I'm so sorry, but it's in the notes. Psalm 7, verse 8. I'll read it for you, where David literally asks God to judge me. He says, "Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness and according to the integrity within me." Isaiah will later say in Isaiah 26, "In the path of God's judgments, we wait. We put ourselves in the path of God's judgment so that we will receive a favorable outcome, a favorable judgment, favorable blessing." So the judgment of God is not always a negative thing. I know in a lot of our common contemporary language and our connotation with judgment is that it's punitive or maybe redemptive, those first two. But the favorable judgment is what's being talked about here. And let me just bring it back up. Rejoice, here it is. Let the daughters of Judah rejoice because of your judgment. That's the favorable judgment. Then we get to verses 12. We'll wrap it up here. Verses 12 through 14. This is kind of the end of the chapter. God's people are instructed to explore the heavenly city, and they get the descriptions of the glorious design of God's heavenly city will be used to describe the character and glory of God. Look at it. Walk about Zion. Go around her. Number her towers. Consider her ramparts. Now, ancient Israel could prophetically do this back in the time of David or Solomon, but be doing this as a prophetic act of their future messianic age. Now, there's no way that the kings of the earth or what happens right at the very beginning of the messianic age, there's so much destruction that there's no beautiful earthly Jerusalem yet. That has to gradually be built. And so there's no way at the very beginning of the messianic age that we could say this would be earthly Jerusalem. It's just not there. It's not ready. It doesn't instantaneously happen. It has to gradually be rebuilt and restored. And I do think that Jesus does that pretty quickly. And I do think that there's going to be elements of this that do relate to earthly Jerusalem, but really in the fullest sense, as we'll talk about more in, we got to go all the way to Revelation 21, but really, really similar language is going to be used. But walk about Zion, go around her, number her towers, consider well her ramparts, go through her citadels, that you may tell the next generation that this is God. Literally, the design, the intricacy of the design of God's heavenly city reveals the nature of who God is. It's beautiful. And that's one of the reasons why Revelation 21 is such an encouraging thing to study. If you want to, you skip ahead, go there. We'll get to Revelation 21 eventually, really as maybe the final week of Seeking Shalom, but we'll get there and we'll be able to come back to Psalm 48 and say, look, here it is. Walk about it. And something that we have to look forward to that we'll literally get to do. And then ending in verse 14, this is God, our God forever and ever. He will guide us forever. The guide of Psalm 67 is here forever. I love it. It's permanent. It's not interim. It's not temporary. It's not partial. It's complete. It's total. And it's permanent. Amen. Love that. Okay. Even as excited as I am about that being the heavenly city, I still have a little bit of reservation about, I don't know, maybe there's some part of that being reflected in the earthly Jerusalem sooner than I think. Maybe, I don't know. But anyway, I'm not saying that I'm not going to hold that as like a really rigid interpretation. But I do think as we go through the rest of the chapters, that interpretation will be borne out and well substantiated.